I'm Ed Nersessian, and on behalf of myself and Francis Levy, I'd like to welcome you to this roundtable on international psychoanalysis 150 years after the birth of Freud. Tonight, the participants are Sandy Abend, who's a member of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and he's been very active at he was originally very active in the American Psychoanalytic, but as he got older, he decided to be more active on the international scene, and is on the Board of Representatives and on the Education Committee of the International, and has been also instrumental in establishing psychoanalytic centers in Korea and Japan. Jacqueline Amati Mehler is a past secretary of the International Psychoanalytic and is a past vice president of the International Psychoanalytic and the past president of the Italian Psychoanalytic. She's here from Rome, and she is the chair of the Committee on Education of the International Psychoanalytic. Claudio Eisirik is the current president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He comes from Porto Alegre, Brazil, and he's a training supervising analyst and professor of psychiatry at the Rio Grande del Sul, at the Federal University, Rio Grande del Sul. Charles Hanley is a supervising training analyst of the Canadian Institute of Psychoanalysis. He's a philosopher and a professor emeritus of philosophy from the University of Toronto, and a representative from North America to the International Psychoanalytic, and has also been extremely active on the international for many, many years. Alain de Mijolla is from Paris. He is the founder and president of the International Association for the History of Psychoanalysis, and he's also the editor of those 3 huge volumes you see back there, which is the International Dictionary of Psychoanalysis, which was first published in France and has now been translated in English. It's a spontaneous discussion. You are free to talk about anything you want, but I would like you to say something about the state of psychoanalysis as you see it today and as you see it in the future. And I'd like you to also keep in mind something that Bob Michaels enunciated clearly last time, that psychoanalysis on the one hand is a treatment, is a mental health profession, and on the other hand, its applied role in different fields. So you may want to address that also.
Well, I think that psychoanalysis as a discipline is thriving, and I will say what I mean by that. Whereas I think that psychoanalysis as a profession is not thriving. What I mean is that there have been enormous achievements in the last decades of psychoanalysis that have had a great impact in society and in our culture. I think that the attention to late Freud and post-Freudian contributions have increased our knowledge enormously. And it has also increased the range of our psychoanalytic function. So that in this sense, to say that psychoanalysis is in crisis, in my opinion, is not correct. I think that psychoanalysis is, on the other hand, always in crisis, as any kind of knowledge that renews itself, that reviews its concepts, that learns more from clinical experience, that nurtures theory as well as theory nurtures our clinical work. But I think we're confronted with a paradox, because instead of integration, I think that there is fragmentation in the way we deal with different models. And I think that there is the risk that eclecticism is kind of coming in the place of pluralism and the capacity to integrate partial theories that are very useful in dealing with new pathologies, and that they somehow increase our range of psychoanalytic thinking and acting. Now, I think that what you just said is very important. Michael said it. I think that psychoanalysis as a theory of the mind is the patrimony of all culture, but I think that as a profession and a treatment, it is a patrimony of the institutions, and I think that it is the institutions that transmit analysis that are in crisis, not the discipline itself. And I hope to have more time to go into this, which I think is our main preoccupation if we're going to look to the future of psychoanalysis, because I think that there is a contradiction about the potential that we have as a theory of the mind and the way we are dealing with its transmission onto the profession.
Claudio, what do you say to that?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with so many distinguished colleagues and friends in this roundtable. I would say that I see psychoanalysis as a discipline, naturally, as a theory, as a profession. Of course, we must take into account Freud's definition from 26, which seems to me still valid. So, in my view, we are not in a crisis, and I agree with Jackie in this idea. Psychoanalysis is not in a crisis because our theory, or our several theories, are developing very well in North America, in Europe, in Latin America. We have several important authors, and I think that one of our problems, theoretically speaking, is the lack of mutual knowledge. For instance, several developments in specific parts of Europe are not well known here in North America, as well as several Latin American developments are not very well known in Europe and in North America. So I think that one of the challenges we still have and we must face is try to face what in Latin America we call the Andes Cordillera, the Andean mountains. You know, in Chile we have all those huge mountains that separate Chile from the other countries in Latin America. And I like to use this metaphor that we have several sorts of huge chains of mountains metaphorically separating different analytic communities. So this is a sort of a challenge. At the same time, we have our main institution and several institutions who try to develop psychoanalysis as a system of training. And here we have several problems because our main legacy is to keep our training as a high standard procedure as much as possible. And I think this is something we must fight very strongly to keep, in spite of the existence of different training models. But the main thing, in my view, in this regard, is try to keep our training as a high standards one. And then we have problems in our discipline. You face specific problems here in North America, of course. I am well aware of them. And we have similar problems in Europe and in Latin America. We have all sorts of challenges from health systems, from government structures, from other trainings, trying to lower the standards and the criteria, and all sorts of different possibilities. So I think that we are not in a crisis as a theory. We are not in a crisis as a clinical practice. I would dare to say that we can practice psychoanalysis today better than our predecessors were able to do because we have their legacy. So I would say that we can be better analysts than Freud, Bion, Klein, Mehler, and Lacan, and so on. We can be, provided that we keep the conditions. But we have a social and economical crisis. We have institutional difficulties. And I think we should and we need to work through all these sorts of difficulties. So in my view, psychoanalysis is a work in progress in several dimensions. And our challenge is exactly to keep this work progressing. These are my first impressions.
I should just say, in terms of the Andes Mountains, that the dictionary that is back there is addressing that issue because it is an international dictionary and describes theories of the various parts of the world in there.
It's a major achievement in our psychoanalytic community because it has in its 3 beautiful volumes an idea of what is international psychoanalysis, authors, institutions, concepts. So I think this is the sort of effort that addresses some of the issues we are trying to discuss this evening.
I have great affection and respect for Jackie Mehler and for Claudio Eisirik, and I think just for the sake of stirring the pot, I will say I disagree that there's not a crisis, although neither one of them said there wasn't a crisis. There is, then there isn't, and in the end I shall come down in the same position. But I was going to say, I was reminded of the joke. If you can keep your head when everybody around them is losing theirs, you just don't understand the situation. Right? Analysts all around the world are convinced that there is a crisis. And if that's the case, there is a crisis. And I do think the crisis has to do not just with institutional matters, but with practice. And I'll say what I mean. I was asked a few months ago to write a piece for the TAP, the American Psychoanalytic Newsletter, on the future of psychoanalysis. And I was very interested. And I don't know if it's come out yet. I'm not sure, so I can say this without fear of spoiling it for those of you who haven't read it, and I hope will read it. I divided my views on this into 3 segments. You know, the future of Freudian ideas, the future of psychoanalytic theory, and the future of psychoanalytic practice. I think they're separable, that they're different. And in brief, I think that the revolution that Freudian ideas brought to the intellectual world over a century ago is immutable and indelible. You know, whatever changes there are modulations, modifications, additions, but so much of him has been absorbed into popular culture that it's not revolutionary anymore. Although it's still revolutionary when it comes to individual conviction and assumption of the core difficult truths that he put us in touch with. Not just about infantile sexuality, but chiefly about the degree to which people, all of us, deceive ourselves unconsciously about our true motivations, our affects, and so on. It's a phenomenal breakthrough discovery, and all of us here would completely agree about that, and I think would agree about the indelible sustenance of those ideas going forward. Theory has evolved, as both referred to. In some ways, the evolution is positive, that we learn. I agree with Claudio. In some ways, perhaps none of us would stand on the same ground. Not all changes are necessarily beneficial. You'll remark, what is valuable is not new, and what is new is not valuable. Some of us would still stand on that conservative ground, but clearly we've learned more than we did, and I do agree with Claudia. We practice better than the old-timers because we've learned. But the future of practice is another question, and that is because of the demographics, because of the environmental shifts. As I said, I happened to be here at the last roundtable, which was talking about this in the American context. When I was a resident in psychiatry, I had to give the lectures on psychopharmacology to medical students because nobody on the faculty knew anything about the drugs. That was 1959. The world has changed. Drugs, psychotherapies that are derived from analysis, psychotherapies that are not derived from analysis, short-term treatments, behavioral treatments. The ways of trying to help people with their troubles have expanded enormously since the time that psychoanalysis was in its, if you will, at the zenith of its popularity. So there's more competition, and nobody wants to do it the hard way if they can do it the easy way. I said that before. I'm afraid that that's still true. So what's going on? I mean, what's going on is in response to the competition and the threat of other treatments and the issues that take different forms in different places, analysis and analysts are changing the way they practice to meet this threat. Jackie Mehler spoke to this in her way. I bet we'll talk about it some more. At dinner with Claudio and Jay Greenberg and I were talking. How much can you change the way analysts think and practice in order to meet the requirements of this competitive, shifting world, and still call it psychoanalysis?
Well,
that's a matter, yes, this is, I mean, it's a matter of debate. It is being debated. It will be debated. Frequency, telephone analysis, what's psychotherapy, what's analysis, do you distinguish? Those are real issues that face the profession, that face all of us as individuals. The answers are different in different places so far. I will only add to this as a hopeful note, because you mentioned that I have experience with Asia. I worked with the Japanese, who have an old society, but I've been working with the Koreans who've been trying since 1990 to be part of the community, and I've worked with them for a dozen years. I'm going back in a couple of weeks. In certain parts of the world, like China, we heard about last time, Korea, where psychoanalysis is relatively new, there is enthusiasm and excitement. That's different from places like, say, Western Europe or the United States, where in some places, you know, in the academic world, well, Freud is passé, you know, you have to read somebody else. It's a different situation. So it's vibrant, it's healthy, it answers needs, it's different in different places, and it will be very interesting in the century to come to see how all this evolves. And I haven't said a word about neuroscience, but we'll come to that later.
So I would like to, I'm not going to use the word crisis, but I would like to question, to some extent, Jackie and Claudio's optimism about psychoanalysis as a body of knowledge.
Can I interrupt a minute?
Yes.
Is it allowed? I'm not optimistic at all. I've been misunderstood. I am so pessimistic about the future of our profession that I said that it's threatening the future of our discipline. So I will keep quiet now and come back later.
Interruptions are permitted.
It will turn out then that we're in agreement, Jackie. I'd put it this way. The problem with psychoanalysis is that it is dangerously philosophical. Why would I say such a thing, having spent a good deal of my life teaching philosophy? If you look back at the last century, you will find a succession of schools of philosophy, beginning with logical positivism, phenomenology, existentialism, linguistic analysis, conceptual analysis, which was something different, etc., etc. These schools of thought rolled through the century, rising and falling, dropping out. There is a pattern in, and this is why I say that psychoanalysis is too philosophical. There's a pattern of exactly the same thing occurring in psychoanalysis. We have theories developing from the very earliest times in opposition to one premise or other of Freud's theory. That process is simply multiplied. We have more recently self-psychology. We now have relational psychoanalysis. We used to have Fairbairn and so on. The good thing about this is that new ideas, new hypotheses are generated. The problem with it is that they're not tested. They're not tested clinically, and we've become so pessimistic about our work, a pessimism which in fact I do not share. I think we just have been losing out on it, and it's very dangerous to the future of psychoanalysis. Testing ideas through clinical observation, that we have reached a point where empirical research is deemed to be non-clinical research. But it's in all kinds of sciences, from astronomy to archaeology, observational, there is such a thing as an observational science. Various ideas are tested by developing theoretical knowledge in adjacent disciplines as well, but primarily through the observation of the field of inquiry. And it seems to me that we have failed that task. And what has tended to happen is that new ideas generate schools of thought that become relatively self-contained, which then engage in fisticuffs with other schools of thought without enlightenment, without search for shareable evidence that would persuade adherents of one school and another that either they were right in the end or they were wrong. But instead we have ideologized psychoanalytic thinking in this way. And I think that that's been a flaw in the development of psychoanalysis throughout the century. It will go on being a flaw until we begin to use clinical observation and clinical work as a valid, difficult. Let me not think, I don't want you to think that I believe it's simple. Difficult, but patient work will produce, I think, significant results and enable us to start to build towards some kind of more unified, tested, and testable theory. So my maxim would be that no one should publish an idea which does not include along with it a clear delineation of how that idea can be tested clinically and what the observations were that motivated the person to put forward the idea in the first place, to really tie speculative hypothesis forming, which is, as a philosopher and a psychoanalysis, I entirely approve of, but to tie that to something in psychoanalysis that we can. We have a method of observation, which philosophy doesn't have. Philosophers are justified in proliferating theories. Psychoanalysts aren't, because in the end, we will be evaluated as a discipline, as a science, and as a clinical discipline, not only and not primarily because of what light we can shed onto other disciplines, which I think is very important, but the extent to which we can bring therapeutic benefits to people. Psychoanalysis is in difficulty because we haven't been successful enough in bringing therapeutic benefits to other people. Because had we been doing that effectively, organized our thinking and our energies to do that in a committed way, it seems to me, given my view of what psychoanalysis can accomplish for people and the benefits that it can generate in the lives of people, we would not be talking about a crisis today.
Can I ask Charles a question? Charles, I suspect that you make the pitch you do, which is perfectly understandable, but I'm more interested in the difficulty that you alluded to than in the promise that you hold out for us. It seems to me that every alternate school, whether it's a self-psychology, relational school, Kleinian, all the debates that we have, which you correctly, I think, describe in large measure as polemical rather than evidence-based, say, but we do help people in this way. In fact, we help them better. That's why we're doing it this way. Now, what kind of evidence, never mind the research form, but what kind of evidence in terms of clinical observation would be useful in resolving these difficulties and differences as you see it going forward? Because I've been struggling with this. Our study group met this week, and we were just talking about, what are the rules of evidence in terms of clinical work? Well, they're different in different places. I mean, we don't have agreement about what constitutes evidence. You're a logical positivist, unreconstructed. I admire that because I happen to share that posture, in spite of all of the shifts that have happened. I heard you speak about that. So you still think that observation of sequence and context is evidence, and I agree with you. We have many colleagues that don't agree with that at all. So if we can't agree about what the evidence is, then how can we test clinical effectiveness?
If I just briefly answer, I think that we have there's a simple, ordinary protocol. I think that most people analysts do try to follow. Initially, when we see a patient, we, at least implicitly, I think we should do it very explicitly, identify what the functional symptomatic problems of the patient are in quite clear and unmistakable terms. A description that any informed observer would be able to say of it, yes, that's correct. And we then, at the end of the treatment, have to say where the patient is with respect to those specific problems which caused them to come into the treatment in the first place. And in such a clear and specific way that any reasonable observer, sufficiently trained, would agree that yes, that is an accurate description. The problem is a practical one and an ethical one, because then you have to have a follow-up to see what has happened 10 years later. But there is it's not an epistemological problem, in my view, or a methodological problem. It is the limitation is an ethical one, and that's one that can be perhaps overcome sufficiently to allow for that kind of testing. And the one test that there is just that the person himself realizes that they are functioning better and they go on functioning, and that is a walking piece of evidence on behalf of the therapeutic utility of psychoanalysis.
One word about this. Your good friend and mine, Owen Rennick, has been standing on that ground very vociferously and very persuasively. I understand he's got a book coming out about this very soon, which he's been very quiet about. But, you know, neither you nor I would agree about Owen's stance in terms of talking about psychoanalysis. His views about many of the things that we cherish. I think, as you do, that these are great questions, but the answers to those questions of clinical results are not so easy to come by. And they don't so readily resolve the kinds of theoretical differences that we're talking about and are concerned about, in my experience.
We can have a patient that is much better after 10 years, and that doesn't mean that we have been doing an analysis with him either. And you can have iatrogenic effects on somebody, and still you have been doing an analysis. So it's very difficult to come to testing the way you...
I would like just to say that I am in full agreement with Charles in the idea that psychoanalysis is a clinical discipline. And I was reminding myself, some years ago I wrote a letter to the most important Brazilian poet when he retired and he presented his last paper. And I was very struck by his many contributions that I used as a psychoanalyst, his poetry. And in his answer he said he doubted that his activity had any human value or human validity. And when he received this sort of feedback, he felt a little bit reassured. So in my view, the only usefulness, something that will remain specific of psychoanalysis, is its clinical usefulness to people. So I think that this is something we should be doing more. But I would like to just remind you that this is not something new. We have a lot of work already done, for instance, in Europe. The European Federation have now several experiences. David Tuckett, for instance, Heide Feinberg, and other colleagues are doing long-term studies of clinical discussions. They meet each year. They follow the same case. they try to establish a sort of methodology. I had the experience of presenting a case material. They almost killed me because I had to explain each interpretation or each question. It's a very lively experience, and I'm sure that you have here this sort of experience here in North America. So I think that from this idea, this is a plan of action, because if we are able to share our clinical experience and to get to some sort of mutual understanding, we are going to do something that Andrea Green is suggesting, that psychoanalysts should be discussing clinical material on the basis of clinical sessions and trying to see what's going on, why, and with what results. So I think this is one of the challenges, but I'm sorry, talking too much.
We need to hear from Alain also.
Last but not least.
Last but not least.
Yes, I apologize because it's very difficult for me to think in English, and I thank very much Ed to have taken the risk of inviting me. Well, I heard, but I did not understand everything that you said, but I heard what you say, and for me, psychoanalysis is always in crisis since the beginning, because Freud made the conflict as the important thing in the mind. Conflict is the spring of life, is the spring of death also, but the spring of life. And we have to consider that the crisis, the so-named crisis, is an epiphenomenon. It's difficult. And
Parlez français, because Ed will help you.
ouais, je pourrais dire en français peut-être. Oui, c'est un épiphénomène de parler de crise. Il y a toujours eu des crises. Il y a toujours eu des crises. Il y a des crises qui viennent du dehors et du dedans.
There are crises that come from outside and some that come from within.
Celles qui viennent du dedans intègrent tous les psychanalystes et tous les gens qui s'intéressent à la psychanalyse.
Those that come from within involve all psychoanalysts and everyone who is interested in
Et je pense que
psychoanalysis.
c'est avec eux qu'il faudrait ouvrir des discussions.
And
Je
it's
suis
with
tout
them
à fait
that we have to
d'accord
discuss.
avec ce que Claudio disait tout à l'heure, qu'il faut des rencontres, qu'il faut des discussions, mais pas seulement dans le cadre d'une institution psychanalytique.
That you have to have dialogues not only within a psychoanalytic institution, but in a broader way and with a larger...
Yes. Et c'est ce que j'ai fait dans le dictionnaire précisément, d'ouvrir, où j'ai fait venir des Jungiens, des Adlériens, Ferenciens, tout ce monde-là, amené à discuter les termes.
So that in the dictionary of the International Dictionary, he didn't limit himself, let's say, to the French school of psychoanalysis, but he brought in the Jungians, the Adlerians, Cohoutians, all the various schools. Forenses, yes, sorry.
Oui, il est extrêmement important qu'on fasse tomber dans ces périodes actuelles les barrages qu'il y avait entre des institutions fermées sur elles-mêmes, ne voyant que leurs petits, parce que cela a amené un vieillissement des institutions.
It is very important at this time to eliminate all the obstacles that were created because of the self-containment of each institution, which aged in itself based on the fact that it wasn't in dialogue and in communication with the other schools and institutions.
Donc il y a un danger que nous vivons actuellement, qui est celui du vieillissement des cadres en psychanalyse.
It's similar to what I said before, that the danger is the aging of the psychoanalytic institutions.
Au début, ceux qui sont venus autour de Freud, Ferenczi, Rank, tout ça, ils avaient 30 ans. Au moment où la psychanalyse est née en France, Lafort et tout, avait une trentaine d'années. Marie Bonaparte était considérée comme une grand-mère parce qu'elle avait 42 ans.
In the beginning of psychoanalysis, the people around Freud, and when psychoanalysis came to France, all the main players in that were in their early 30s. Marie Bonaparte was considered to be a grandmother because she was in her early 40s. So I guess the point is that now psychoanalytic candidates are in their 60s.
Yes, it's a real problem, to my opinion. A real problem to whom we have to think about. Because it's very important for the future to understand how the formation that we have prepared since the beginning mène à cela, je mélange, conduit à cela.
That we need to see what has led to the fact that we've ended up in this position where we have more and more aging candidates.
Je pense qu'il faudrait, dans les problèmes de formation, justement attirer des jeunes et leur donner la possibilité d'avoir une formation psychanalytique sans s'engager pour autant dans 10 ans d'une dictique.
That you should bring in younger people without having, and this to some degree pertains more to France than it does to the other, certainly doesn't apply to America. In France, you have to have an analysis before you start your analytic training. And so some people have had already 10 years of analysis when they apply to the institute. So he feels that that should be changed.
Ça, c'est un des aspects nombreux que vous allez pouvoir discuter aussi. Quant aux crises à l'extérieur, c'était les crises intérieures. Et quant aux crises extérieures, elles sont liées aux modes.
Outside, the crisis with the rest of the world is fashion, connected to fashion.
Oui, en France, on a eu des up, des down, up, down. On a eu, entre autres, le méga Lacan qui a fait de l'image de psychanalyse une énorme chose. Or maintenant, elle s'est dégonflée. Alors ce n'est pas une crise, c'est un retour à une réalité.
In France, Lacan had such a blown-up image that after he died, it all collapsed. And so now, but the collapse meant it went back to the way it should have been before Lacan blew it up the way he did. It was more realistic.
Like a French soufflé.
Yes, absolutely. The cooking always was the OSV.
French soufflé.
Soufflé. Yes, it was like that. And also the reputation of psychoanalysis as therapeutic était aussi complètement excessive.
It was exaggerated, its reputation.
On attendait de la psychanalyse qu'elle dépasse Lourdes, les miracles, Mais non, ça n'était pas cela. Le point de vue thérapeutique de l'analyse est un petit aspect de la pensée analytique.
That there was too much of an expectation. It was like you would expect miracles from psychoanalysis, whereas the therapeutic benefits of psychoanalysis are really a small part of the general analytic thought.
Et la crise actuelle est que les gens voient dans les neuroleptiques, dans les neurosciences, dans le comportementalisme, tout ce qui va remplacer la psychanalyse.
So they look into other things like medication and yoga. What is going to take the place of psychoanalysis and bring about the miracles?
Yes. Donc je crois qu'il faut un peu tirer des leçons de tout cela, se calmer un peu au niveau des crises et puis adopter une attitude plus réaliste et plus ouverte.
So we need to calm down and take a more realistic outlook and a more open outlook.
Parce que la psychanalyse va s'enrichir des Coréens, va s'enrichir des Chinois, va s'enrichir des Africains du Sud et du Nord, va s'enrichir de tous ces gens du monde entier qui, avec leurs pensées, vont nous apporter des modes de concevoir les mêmes notions et nous aurons à discuter tout cela.
That psychoanalysis will be enriched from the fact that there will be a Korean group, there will be Chinese, there will be African, and that these people new to psychoanalysis will bring a way of looking at the current notions which would be enriching to us.
Voilà.
Well,
Not so optimistic.
no. I think that what Alain said is very important, that there is an internal aspect and there is an external aspect. and I agree with most of the things you said, except that I think our problem is how we deal between the internal aspects and the external aspects. And it is there that we are terribly in crisis. Absolutely. So I would like to distinguish what I said before when I mean psychoanalysis as a discipline is not in crisis, because it has enriched itself with new knowledge. We know a great deal more, for instance, about early psychic organization, about how to decode without countertransference, pre-verbal, verbal communication. There is a whole enormous range of pathologies that were not considered as analyzable. And today there is a debate on whether we can analyze pathologies that were until now considered as not being able to be susceptible to the analytic method. And on that there is an arena of debate. And this is a very important aspect that comes close to what you said about exchanging a great deal among us of discussion. I don't think we all mean by psychoanalysis the same thing. We don't.
Yes.
And so this is one of our main problems. We don't have clear ideas about the difference between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. And this depends on the way we are training people. It depends on the way we analysts are dealing with maintaining the specificity of our method and how we're dealing with the competition that we ourselves created. Because it is us analysts that created all sorts of parallel shortcut training. And although now a lot of people are, saying, oh, it's terrible, let's do something about it, but we're in the condition of closing the doors, the gates of the barn when all the cows have escaped. And so we are competing with people who are competing with our profession, calling themselves psychoanalysts. And the way we're dealing internally with this is by an expansionistic attitude. And here I come to the fact China, Korea, Russia, all that, we're dealing with a crisis of the culture in our modern society with, instead of dealing with internally with these kind of challenges that the society is putting to us, we're dealing with it in a manner that I think is, suicidal for our practice and for our profession. We're training people in different countries and in different areas, and we cannot train the way we are training people when we say let us stick at the same time to standards. We can't stick to standards when we're going to train people in China, when we're going to train people the way we're training them in some Eastern countries. In the European Federation, we are 20 societies, and probably within the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have 40 societies or 35 societies with very, very different ideas of what psychoanalysis is, yes, with very, very different ways of having been trained and so on. So I think we're facing an enormous problem and crisis from this point of view, from the point of view of how we're dealing with the transmission of psychoanalysis. And this is extremely important because the way we train is the way we are going to carry psychoanalysis onto society at large, onto the field of mental health, to culture in general, because whatever you do, whether you're a clinical practitioner, whether you're an academic, whether you're a teacher, whether you do research, it depends how you are an analyst, what you're going to do. So I think that we cannot underrate the crisis of our practice. It's true, I agree with Sandy, we practice better, in a certain way. But we're not training people better, and in the long run, we're not going to have a good practice. That's why I say I'm quite pessimistic. I'm pessimistic because the facts that Alain was talking about, the way we are dealing with the outside problems, we're being challenged by it, and we are flexibilizing our method, flexibilizing our training, flexibilizing, as I said before, pluralism, and mixing it up with eclecticism and confusion. That's not going to help. That's not what I mean with including partial theories in our practice. So that I think we have a real problem there. A problem for the current president of the IPA.
Oui, je voulais simplement ajouter à ce que disait Jacqueline, c'est que le problème ne peut être résolu que par un échange, dans la mesure où la transmission, on ne peut jamais savoir à qui on transmet et comment on transmet. Jamais on ne sait.
Transmet.
Et qui transmet. La transmission se fait par quelque chose d'autre. Et je crois que la pensée de Freud nous permet peut-être de nous comprendre et de comprendre ce qu'il y a au-delà de toutes ces règles. Les règles et les lois de transmission, à mon avis, sont des artefacts.
A great part of the world. I'm sorry.
What I think you were saying was that there would be something enriching from transmitting of the ideas, but that and you have to leave the rules and so on out of the transmitting of ideas, and then I guess you are implying that you hope that then through that transmission something good will happen.
You were saying about Freud, I've been traveling all over the places, as you can imagine, through my office, and I can tell you that there are many more institutes that you would imagine in which you don't read Freud anymore.
Yeah. They have law, they have rules, they have formation, sessions, supervisions, but not Freud. Yeah, that's a real problem.
Charles.
There is a real problem that Jackie identifies with the expansion of psychoanalysis into areas geographically remote from centers of training, which was true of Eastern Europe. It was true of Asia, obviously, and Africa. So one has to somehow deal with that problem. The way historically it was dealt with by the IPA in Eastern Europe was to reduce the training requirements, because if you were a Pole or a Russian or a Romanian, you could not. We tried bringing people to America, to Canada, to England.
France.
They never returned. Life was so much better in Europe and North America that you would have to be unanalyzed in order to choose to go back. Your children have been in school for 5 to 6 years. Their language now is English or French or German, not Russian or Pole. And so there was a very real problem. And my view of it at the time, and I still stick to it, is we had no choice but to accept methods that would allow these, and before they were impoverished to boot, we would have to accept methods that would allow them to become well enough prepared in psychoanalysis through whatever devices we could manage, so that they could then establish societies and training institutes of their own in which gradually, over a decade, they could then begin to function according to the training requirements and the background knowledge required by the great institutes of Europe. And I have not been in a position to evaluate the success of that scheme, but it was with that spirit that informed it, not to reduce standards, but to help these people find a practical way to reach minimum IPA standards. And I think that's a legitimate strategy in those circumstances.
To take a more less pessimistic view and related to what Charles is saying, psychoanalysis as it was understood and practiced in 1920 or 1915 or 1930 or 1940 is very, very different from the way psychoanalysis is today. Later rereading of Freud's papers and his clinical cases have revealed that what he was doing there was very different in the actual practice of it than in the preaching of it. So one could also therefore optimistically say that if you get a place running, then they within themselves will go through the same mutations as psychoanalysis went in Europe and in America and South America, and eventually achieve a higher degree of sophistication and understanding of psychoanalytic process and theory. Why would not one feel optimistic that way?
I think that is a very good argument, and it is just a little bit of hope that that could happen.
Yes.
It is a little bit of hope that it could happen.
On peut avoir de l'espoir en
a
Freud.
little bit. But you know, I think that there is one of the ways I think we have been trying to deal with the external problems is with the idea, let us expand psychoanalysis as quickly as possible so that we don't lose it. Psychoanalysis was not constructed to haste and to rapid things. It needs its time to grow. And so I think that in a way we are going against this in the way we're dealing with the problems that we have.
For instance, let me share with you a current problem. China. Several colleagues are traveling to China, accepting invitation from different groups of psychotherapists or psychiatrists. We realized that this is not an organized movement, there is no coordination, it's happening. So the IPA decided this time to try to put some order, to try to plan, to have something more organized, to find out what's going on. And this is not an easy decision because, for instance, we could have decided, let it be. Let happens what can happen. And I think that we are living something similar to what happened in East Europe. And in a way, it's happening in several countries of Latin America, where there is no organized psychoanalysis, no presence of the IPA. So the idea is to try to see what's going on in China, what can we do, what kind of relationship with this very strange reality, very complex, very difficult political configurations. It's not clear whether a real analytical training can be performed there, or can we have successive approximations or successive steps. So I think that not being optimistic or pessimistic, but trying to be realistic. I think that we receive demands, we receive invitations. There is a certain thirst for psychoanalysis, for psychoanalytic thinking. But I would like to shift a little bit. When Jean-Paul Sartre went to Brazil, he was invited to lecture. And it was a huge place. You know that Brazil is a multiracial society. We have people from many different origins. And he was sitting there to present his lecture, and there were about 400 or 500 people. And he was looking, and then he just presented one question. Where are the black people from Brazil? Is this Brazil? Or is this the elite? To whom am I talking? So I was looking around, and I would like to present a question. Where are the young people? Where are the candidates? To whom are we talking? Are we talking among ourselves? Are we opening ways of communications with our candidates? Are we welcoming their requests? Are we accepting their suggestions? I think that this is something that we should also take into account, that psychoanalysis runs the risk of getting elderly if we do not find ways of talking to young, talented, bright people from several different origins. And and activities. So I think that several actions are challenging us, because if we do not find ways of working with people outside, as Alain was saying, I think that we run the risk of talking among ourselves. And in this sense, I see that new challenges in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or other places must be faced. We must find ways of doing this. And at the same time, keeping the highest possible standards. My view is that psychoanalysis, as Freud used to say, is a sort of a plague that once introjected somehow works in the mind and stimulates people to find a proper way of doing it. So I think that our challenge is to make it alive.
I'm really glad that you came back to the question of the aging profession and how do we attract talented young people. Because there are real issues with that, in my opinion. And I trained in psychiatry in the 50s. It's 50 years ago. Now, at that time, the cutting edge, it seemed to me, for bright young people, especially if they're a little neurotic, was to understand people better.
Which all the people at that time were.
A few of us were. The Freudian Revolution was still, in terms of American psychiatry at least, relatively recent, because it was the impact of World War II, where few psychiatrists trained in analytic principles met others through the military, that led to an expansion of psychodynamic psychotherapy and psychoanalytic ideas in American medical psychiatric education. And chairmen of departments in the 40s and 50s were analytically trained. Right? And that was very attractive then for the bright young people. Right? I don't wonder how many chairmen of psychiatry at this point have analytic training. They're neuroscientists, because that's the exciting cutting edge. And the bright young people, unless they have a special reason to be very interested in the mind, are interested in understanding the brain and the way the mind as a function of brain. I mean, I'm not separating the two, but what I'm saying is the appeal to the bright young people who are not otherwise committed is not going to be to enter psychoanalysis, which is old stuff, except among our own debates. So we do have the challenge to find ways to attract bright and talented people. Now, I don't think we need 10 million of them, but I do think we need to find those who can create and do something for us, and not just accept for training middle-aged people who are disappointed that they didn't do this early and want to do something else. I mean, but you know, institutions want to train, so if that's what they can get, that's what they get. That's a real challenge for the future, and you're trying to address it, and I don't have answers for it. But really, that's a profound issue of reaching out to the talented young people for the future of psychoanalysis.
Jackie?
Well, I'm glad we're finally coming to see how we challenge, how we go about the challenges that we have here, not in China, in Russia, or in Korea, but here. That is our problem. We don't have candidates. We get less patients. Psychoanalysis is losing prestige. These are our problems. And we're all expanding outside instead of looking what's happening around our own houses.
Yeah,
and we are avoiding this all the time. And so finally it's coming out.
I think that Claudio made a very important point when he talked about the generational problem, because that really is quite serious. And I would be interested in Jackie commenting on something that you talked to me about this afternoon in relation to this specific problem. I taught for many years at the university in the philosophy department, but I always taught courses in psychoanalysis, which were much better attended than the courses that were taught in philosophy. And there was a rage reaction in the department when it came about that students rebelled because they wanted to have a full year on Freud, when they were quite happy to have only a half year on Kant. So I received during that period many inquiries by young, bright, gifted young people who wanted to pursue a career in psychoanalysis. And I would explain to them what additional requirements after the BA they would require in order to be admitted for training or considered for admission to training by an institute. One of them proceeded. Another is now training much later after a teaching career or in the midst of a teaching career. They could not see this as a practical career. Complicated in Ontario because they would have to also be physicians if they wanted to be assured of a livelihood. But I think that that's generally true, and that we need to look at our admission requirements from that point of view. Are there ways in which we can improve on our training and our education so as to bring younger people into training who are highly gifted and have a great deal of promise? And I think, Jackie, you've been experimenting with that in Rome.
Yeah, we have. If I may say just one word about the situation in Italy where I live. You know, I was trained just 5 years after you in Boston, so we lived the age of gold of psychoanalysis and psychiatry. Now,
Except for the fact that you were in Boston instead of New York, that's true.
okay,
Not gold,
Yeah.
but
false gold.
well,
Yes.
I'm not sure. But the point is that, for instance, in Italy, they have now passed a law whereby we have the different problem that you have in France with aging people. You can apply to psychoanalysis the minute you graduated from medicine or psychology. No specialization, no training in clinical psychology or psychiatry. So we get people of about 25, 26 years old with no experience at all of life. They're kind of late adolescents. So we have the opposite problem that you have. And these people are faced with a situation in which we have about 400 training places that imitate our institutes. And the people go on, internet, and they apply to 300 places at the same time to see which is more convenient, which costs less, which is shorter. And being the director of the institute, I get mails that ask me, how much does it cost? How much does it last? How many hours would I have to study? I mean, it's so depressing, and certainly it's quite different. I mean, but to get people enthused, young people, you have to see in each place what the context is, because it's very different, you see.
Oui, je voulais simplement dire que j'aimerais qu'on remplace peut-être le mot psychanalyse par la manière de penser de Freud.
Replace the term psychoanalysis by the way of thinking that Freud.
Cela permettrait de mieux situer, de mieux centrer le problème, parce que la psychanalyse est devenue une espèce de monstre,
oui,
mais qui est démesuré.
Psychoanalysis has become, as a word, has become like a monster, whereas if you limit yourself to Freud's thoughts, then you have a more limited, workable.
Et dans ce qu'a dit Claudio tout à l'heure, de ce qui se passait en Chine, moi j'ai été tout à fait sensible au fait qu'il fallait aller en Chine et causer, parler, et ne pas imposer des lois. Si on veut
to go to China and talk rather than go and impose your rules and regulations.
On n'impose pas la démocratie dans des peuples qui n'ont pas eu justement une formation démocratique. Il faut des années, il faut du temps. Si on veut leur imposer tout de suite notre mode de pensée à nous, il faut petit à petit les habituer. Et je crois que c'est Freud qui permet, à ce moment-là peut-être, de très très doucement arriver à faire passer des idées, à faire une formation, mais une vraie là, cette fois-ci. Enfin, c'est en tout cas ce que j'ai ressenti à ce que tu disais tout à l'heure.
That you have to try to communicate Freud's ideas in a slow, gradual way rather than impose certain structures right up front. And then hopefully over a period of time this will itself build on itself.
C'est un mode de pensée très français. But I'd like to speak about Asia a little bit because I do have experience there, and it's relevant to some of these questions that we have. Larry Friedman and I served in the Navy in Japan more years ago than we like to count. And on the basis of that immersion, when the IPA first made a committee to help the Pacific Rim with psychoanalytic training and expansion in '95, I was the designated member from the North America because somebody knew that I had been in Japan. That's how I got involved, although I had been to Korea before then. Now, so I've been with that endeavor in the IPA now for longer than anybody else continuously. And it's very instructive in certain ways. The Japanese, for example, had a psychoanalytic society back in the 50s. All of these societies started the same way as Freud. You know, somebody had an analysis with Freud, came back to his hometown, and started a group, and they were, you know, and they had sanction or they didn't have sanction, and they soon had splits, and they had other people. And anyway, that's how psychoanalysis grows, like mushrooms in the dark. But in Japan, it had emerged in a way that it was they were still part of the international, but very secretive, and they weren't doing psychoanalysis that had very much to do with the ideas of, I don't know about Freud, but with what the rest of the community would call psychoanalysis until somebody blew the whistle, as it were, in Amsterdam. And they had gone far away from IPA standards, and there was a big hurrah. And anyway, so that's how I got re-involved with them as they were fixing what had gone wrong. But you have to understand, if you think of it, it's not just that the cultural differences have something to do with the way ideas develop, but nobody in the Japanese societies was being analyzed by anybody who had been analyzed. Their analysts were their own people who were doing their own thing. It was very difficult. Now, Korea is quite different. The problems are not easy, but they're very different. Again, they started with a couple of dedicated people. By the way, they read Freud. They read Freud. And other people as well, but they are not dismissive in this way. Their cadre of interested people developed into a cadre of would-be leaders who struggled. They would come to the States or to Britain or France, somewhere, to get some analytic training and some analysis. Not enough by our standards, but something. A year, 2 years, a few get 5 years. Then they go back and they try to work within the context of analytic ideas in a very conscientious way. It's very hard because they can't leave their country for a long enough time to get a proper analysis because they're out of the national health system if they do that. They don't have work when they go back. It's hard to get good analysis except for the rare ones. Some of them don't come back. Many of them do. But they keep trying. What's interesting, I'm going to cut this short to tell you what's exciting about it because I'm going back there again and say, this cadre of dedicated people, we have now 3 people among them who are trained to IPA standard, have passed direct membership. We need 1 more to make them into a study group. One of them is a super talented guy. One of them is a competent one. One of them is, I think, very well trained because he had training, a lot of extra training in the States. It's going to be very good. It's the same scatter that you would find in any other institute. You know, one good one, one not so good one very talented person who got there in spite of the fact that his training was limited. You know, that's not. But what I want to say is they have a group of 20 to 50 young people there whom they've attracted, who are very interested and talented. When a group of Americans who teach them didactically in San Francisco every year meet them, they all present cases. It's fascinating. Some of them are very talented. Now, some of them will be psychotherapists, and we can come, before we stop, we should probably talk about the future of psychotherapy. But some of them will get analytic training. They'll find a way. They'll do something. There is in those places and excitement in a small group of talented young people if there are analytic teachers who believe in analysis who can inspire them. That's what I have to say. And that would be true any place, I hope.
In a few minutes, I'm going to ask people to ask questions and enter the discussion with the rest of you.
It's worth noting is the person who blew the whistle on the Japanese was a candidate.
Right.
I would like to ask a question. Some of us here have been very active in the IPA, and I sort of have a vision, you know, of the future. We have 10,000 members, I don't know how many institutes. A question, is our expansion in Japan, Russia, the priority of our international psychoanalytic
I'm sorry, I didn't...
Is this our priority? That is the problem. We are discussing on that, but I don't think it's our priority. Our priorities are the problems that we have in our places where we already have institutes and where we have no candidates, no patients, competitions, no distinction of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, no real studying of psychoanalysis. That is our these are the priorities. That's the problem. I understand your argument about maybe we'll do something positive, but I'm having a general vision of the future of psychoanalysis. And within that, if we go on talking about Japan and this, we're not facing the problems. This is my idea.
I just would like to, one word about something that Sandy said about belief. You remember that there is a moment when Bion said about the faith of the psychoanalyst. The analyst should keep the faith as someone who is thrown in the water amidst sharks, and he believes he will survive in spite of everything. I think that's one of our problems. Am I correct? The two? Yes. I think that one of the challenges for the future is that sometimes it seems to me that some of us are losing the faith in the strength and vitality of our method. And I think that this is something we should address, because if we, who are the teachers, lose the belief and the faith that psychoanalysis is the best method of treatment for psychic suffering, then we are lost. And from time to time, it seems to me that some of our colleagues become very enthusiastic about other forms of treatment. Of course, they are important. Nobody will deny the importance of drugs and brief therapies and behavioral, cognitive, and so on. But the specificity and the strength and the potential of reaching a psychic change, this is ours. And we cannot lose sight of this strength. So perhaps one of the challenges we have for the future is how to keep and develop this among ourselves and with our younger colleagues.
That's it.